Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Einstein Circle virtual program, and welcome to those attendees from Conversations Before Midnight. We're delighted to have you here today. I see members of our governing board, our science and security board, as well as others. My name is Rachel Bronson. I'm the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. I'm delighted to have you here with us today for this conversation with Lord Martin Rees, with welcoming remarks from Governor Jerry Brown, the executive chair of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. This is a new program format for us, so we're delighted that you're participating. As many of you know, we've been recently hosting monthly virtual programs, and those tend to draw large audiences from around the world. For this one, we wanted to try to tighten up the circle and offer something to our Einstein Circle members, our closest supporters, friends, and those who attended Conversations Before Midnight. So let us know what you think of this format as we move forward. We are trying to recreate a kind of roundtable feel. So thank you for having your videos on for those of you who have them on. For those of you who don't, if you feel comfortable, we'd really love to see you. Because though we are at a larger number, then it'll be easier for me to keep track of. When we do get to the Q&A portion, which will be the second half of this hour, please use the raise your hand function so that I can see who has questions. So if you have a question, if you're coming in already with a question, or as we go through it, please feel free to raise that, and I'll be able, hopefully, to call on as many of you as possible. Well, I will call on as many of you as possible. We are recording this, and so this will be on our YouTube channel. There's a number of people who couldn't join us today who had hoped to, and we will be sharing this with them as well. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Governor Jerry Brown.
Thank you, Rachel. It's a real pleasure to be on this show, particularly with Martin Rees. Lord Martin Rees is a fellow of Trinity College. He used to be the master there at Cambridge. He's president of the Royal Society. He's a co-founder of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. And that really is part of the topic, or is the topic. And I would just note that over there at Oxford, they have a similar group, and their man, Toby Ord, he predicts that the chances of humanity getting through the 21st century without what he calls extinction or a collapse, an unrecoverable collapse of civilization, are 1 in 6. I'm happy to say that I think Martin Rees is a little more optimistic. I have his book on the future, and I want to just show it here because this book is very optimistic from my point of view, particularly since I came across Martin Rees in his book, Our Final Hour. That was the title of the American book, and I can say that was a little bit on the existential, ominous, kind of doomsaying, 100 seconds to midnight perspective. So I think Lord Rees, with his more recent book, has laid out some pathways by which humanity can save itself, and big emphasis on science, clear thinking, and getting at what is important. And before I turn it over to Martin, I just do want to say we have a real dilemma that if the experts tell us how dire or how dangerous modern technology now is in the hands of human beings, people tend not to listen. It's too overwhelming, too frightful. But if you don't tell them, then they don't really rise to the occasion and embrace the kind of difficult changes that are needed. So that is really the dilemma. If you tell the truth, people may not probably can't hear it. If you don't tell them the truth, well, that's a disservice. So I think Martin can handle that paradox very well, and I turn it over to you, sir.
Great. Let me take it from here and start the conversation. Thank you, Governor. And I agree. I'm going to endorse the book as well for everybody who hasn't read it. It's a great one. I just reread it again last night and highly recommend it. So let me start with exactly where the governor kind of set us up to start. Martin, you define yourself as a techno-optimist, but a political pessimist. Please explain.
Yes. Well, I do define myself as a techno-optimist and a political pessimist. I think anyone who does science has to be optimistic about its achievements and its potential achievements. But of course, the problem is that the more science empowers us, the higher the stakes are, using it for either good or for ill. And so this century is the first when science has so empowered us, and there are so many of us on this planet, that humans can determine the planet's fate in the future. And that depends on how we deploy our scientific knowledge. I think it's depressing in a way that the gap between the way the world is and the way it could be, if we applied science optimally, is still very wide. But on the other hand, we know that although science can deal with our problems, the misuse of science can destroy us all. So the stakes are very, very high. And it's important that citizens should be aware of what science can do for us.
Do you want to add something about being a political pessimist? You sit in the House of Lords, so what you have to say matters a lot on that.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, I think it's hard not to be a political pessimist when we look at what's happening now. But I think if we just look at the state of the world and realize that we're in a world where things are so unequal, both within countries and between countries, that the 2,000 people who are the richest in the world could double the income of the bottom billion. And that's a huge inequality. And that, I think, represents an indictment of our civilization as a whole. And I think that is why I'm pessimistic. And indeed, if I can go back to a historical analogy, I sometimes contrast our situation with that in the Middle Ages. And I quote in my book, when I visit Ely Cathedral, which is a marvelous building just about 10 miles away from where I live. And this building was put up in the 12th or 13th century by Masons whose world was limited to Europe, maybe even to a far smaller area, who thought the world may only exist for another 1,000 years. Their horizons were limited, but nonetheless, they built a cathedral which they knew wouldn't be finished in their lifetime. In contrast, today, we know that the world is much larger than they realized. We know we're part of some vast universe which has a lifespan of billions of years. But nonetheless, we don't plan ahead. We don't build cathedrals. We don't build things which will be appreciated by future generations, and buildings like cathedrals which inspire us today, 8 centuries after they were built. But there is a reason. The reason is that in the Middle Ages, life was very difficult, but those who built the cathedral thought that their grandchildren would live lives roughly like theirs. And they were fairly confident that even if they didn't see the finished cathedral, their grandchildren would, and they would appreciate it. Whereas now, things are changing so fast that we don't really know the preferences and tastes of 2 generations ahead. And that is, I think, one reason why we don't plan long term. Things will be so different and people will be so different. And that's why, in contrast to what we need to be doing in many cases, we are not planning ahead. Our horizons are short. And that is one reason why we are not coping with things like climate change, nor are we preparing for the downsides of technology. The fact that a few rogues are empowered by this technology and they can create massive cyber attacks, and they will be able to produce engineered pandemics using technology widely available, all these things. And we have to ensure that we don't lead to a world which becomes anarchic simply because a few people can have a global effect. I like to say there'll be in the global village, there'll be village idiots with a global range. And that's a big challenge for governments. And I think it's going to only be solved if we try to balance the tension between three things we want to preserve: privacy, security, and liberty. And I think we're going to have to give up on at least one of those if we want to ensure that we don't suffer from the cascading effects of one person of evil intent empowered by technology. But that's a very long answer. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's quite all right. There's a lot in there, and it's given me a lot of natural follow-ups. One of the things you talk about often is the fragility of the modern system based on interconnection. So you talk about how the advances have been so robust, and you often go back and compare the difficulties of life in days gone by compared to now. But there's a theme about the fragility of the current system and how we underappreciate the fragility of that. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, well, I think COVID-19 has been a wake-up call for many things like that. It's taught us that we are dependent on these elaborate systems and that we need to change in a number of ways. I mean, one obvious thing is we want to change the balance between efficiency and resilience. It's efficient in a way to have a long supply chain and just-in-time delivery and all that. But that is subject to breakdown if one link in the chain breaks, which may stop production of cars in a whole country or something like that. And so that's an example where it's better to be more resilient and have multiple supply chains and inventories, etc., than just-in-time delivery and one supply chain. And also in hospitals, it may look efficient if your intensive care beds are more than 90% occupied most of the time, but that gives you no spare capacity. So I think we've learned from COVID-19, given that similar catastrophes may befall us in future, that we need to keep spare capacity and deal with them. And as regards our fragility, let's contrast the recent pandemic with the Black Death in the Middle Ages. In that disaster, bubonic plague, in many towns, half the population died, but the rest just went on fatalistically. Whereas I say in my book that if we had a pandemic and more than 1% of the population died, that would overwhelm the capacity of hospitals, and those who were sick would not have their expectations met, and that could very well lead to social breakdown. So society is fragile. It depends on us ensuring that we don't have a big gap between what people expect and what they can have. And of course, to illustrate the fragility, think how much worse things would have been had the internet failed during the shutdown, the pandemic. We do depend very much on all these things working, and they are fragile and interconnected.
I thought it might take a moment, since so many of us are sitting in our homes right now, for you to talk about the new preface that you added to your book On the Future. So On the Future laid out a lot of the risks in terms of bio threats. You talk about bioterror and bio error, and I hope to get to that. You talk about cyber and AI and how to think about this in a way it's just astounding how you're able to pull it together all in one relatively short book. But I wonder if you could focus on that preface where you kind of charge yourself to try to figure out what are the lessons we're learning about, what this century is going to bring us. What have we learned? What should we learn? What have we learned? And so I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that with the hindsight of having written the book and then having to think about it, how to update it for the current situation that we're in now.
Yes. Well, as an advertisement, let me say that the paperback version of the book, which came out last October, is updated, because the book itself made predictions about pandemics, but it went to press before COVID-19, whereas in this book, I've been able to add an extra chapter as a preface, which includes lessons learned through COVID-19. And they include ones I just mentioned, that there's a trade-off between resilience and efficiency, and we need to raise the priority of being resilient against these things. But it does really also discuss how we are going to cope in a world where we need to be better prepared for all these things, and where there can be a cascade because, for instance, we weren't adequately prepared for COVID-19. Certainly in my country, the UK, we were prepared for influenza pandemics, but not for something that required protective clothing and where we didn't have vaccines, etc. So we were not prepared for those. We need to realize that we are going to be subject to pandemics, and we need to be more prepared for them. We need also to realize how interconnected we are internationally. And one thing we can do to reduce the probability of pandemics, obviously, is to make sure that we catch them at source, to make sure that any Vietnamese farmer recognizes any strange disease in his animals, which may be some new emergent virus. We've got to have strengthened WHO to do that sort of thing, and we need to have better international regulation for the use of more powerful technologies. I think we should worry about natural pandemics, but I think, as I already mentioned, we should worry about engineered pandemics. I think a lot is being done. I know the academies have got together to try and impose regulation on the use of genetic modification techniques and what's called gain of function experiments, where you can make a virus more virulent or more transmissible. These clearly need to be regulated, and there have been agreed forms of regulation. But my worry is that enforcing these regulations worldwide, even if we all agree on what the regulation should be, is not easy, any more than enforcing the drug laws globally or enforcing the tax laws globally. And so that is why I'm very, very worried about the possibility of engineered pandemics, or indeed engineered massive cyber attacks on the electric grid or on the internet, etc. I think that's very serious. Incidentally, as a digression, which is mentioned in the book, there has been some debate, as you know, about whether COVID-19 was entirely natural or whether it was some sort of leakage from the laboratory. And in fact, this interested me because I had, some years earlier, made a suggestion that there could be engineered pandemics or pandemics arising from leakages, in other words, error or terror. And in fact, I'd made a bet at the Long Bets website, which is part of the Long Now Foundation, that by the end of 2020, there would be an instance of bioerror or bioterror, which would kill 1 million people. Now that time has passed. We've had the pandemic, which has killed more than 10 million people. But of course, I had limited my bet, which of course I fervently hope to lose, to a instance of bioerror or bioterror. And of course, that is a controversial question. Most people think it was something that came from animals, not that, but there is a view which has been expressed by some serious people that it could be a leakage from the lab. And in fact, Steven Pinker, a well-known optimist on all things, had taken a bet with me about 5 years ago on this. And we talked about what the settlement should be now. And we decided we weren't prepared to settle because of this uncertainty. Because if it was a leakage from a lab, I win. If it's natural, he wins. And we said, though, at the end, that we hoped that we would never know the answer to that question. Because if it was a leakage from the lab in China, then this tragedy would have a villain. And think of what it would do for already pretty dismal UK-Chinese, US-Chinese relationships. So we hope that it can never be proved whether it was a leakage from the lab. And I suspect it never can be, and is perhaps rather unlikely. But of course, in future, we do have to worry about the security in more than 60 of these so-called level 4 secure labs around the world.
I think, and for those of you interested in this, Hallie dropped into the chat a nice summary that Steven Pinker and Martin Rees wrote in the New Statesman about this bet and how to reconcile it. I do want to shortly move to a more fulsome conversation with those of you attending. If you do have questions, use the raise the hand function so that I can see you and call on you. And for those who are comfortable to put themselves on video, we'd appreciate seeing you. Before we come to the end of this part of the conversation, I've got just a couple questions for you still. One is, deep into your book, you wrote the following, which I was struck with, and I want you to comment on. You said, 2 trends are reducing interpersonal trust. Firstly, the remoteness of globalization of those we routinely have to deal with. And secondly, the rising vulnerability of modern life to disruption, the realization that hackers and dissidents can trigger incidents that cascade globally. You've touched on this a little bit in your conversation today, but I thought this focus on trust was worth coming back to, because you wouldn't necessarily expect to find that in your book. Just like I think people find it surprisingly that we talk about the deterioration of trust in the Doomsday Clock statement. But can you talk us through your decisions to include this focus on trust and maybe expand on it a little bit?
Well, I think it's linked to the fact that we are dependent on mega corporations who run websites, etc., and we feel pretty helpless in dealing with them, and because we don't have any personal contact. And if you just think of everyday life, I mean, when I was young, I grew up in a very small town in the country in England, where all the people one dealt with, one knew personally. You knew all the shopkeepers and person who ran the petrol station and the local farmers, etc. Whereas now you can live a life almost entirely online, or going to very large and impersonal shops, etc. So there isn't the same degree of personal contact with the people who support our everyday life, the bus drivers and people who give us our food, etc. There's less of that, and I think it does lead to more mistrust. And of course, it's far easier to get away with behavior which breaches trust. I mean, for instance, during the pandemic, the amount of cyber crime vastly increased. And that's because people are at home, and rather than go out and do burglaries, they will do cybercrime. So it's really that we're in a world where it's easy to carry out malevolent acts with a minimal chance of being caught. And one doesn't really have the direct personal contact with the person you're damaging.
Thank you. We do have some questions, but I can't end this portion of the conversation without just returning to where we are in the Ukraine and the kind of the renewed attention being placed to nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. At the Bulletin, we've been warning that the deterioration of US-Russian relations are very dangerous, and it seems like we've gone back in time. You've thought a lot about these issues. These are the issues that first got you, I think, kind of politically active and captured your imagination.
Yes.
Could you give us a few comments on how you're thinking about what you're seeing? And then we'll flip over to Q&A.
Well, I'm very diffident because there are people I'm sure on this call who've got much more expertise than me. But I think we were saved from disaster in the nuclear age because the relevant actors were all rational. And of course, the concern is whether that is still the case. We hope it is, but of course, Putin's recent speech caused concern, as you will know, about whether the fact that he was closed off from all but a few of his cronies was weakening his sort of real rational strategic thinking. We don't know, but I think we are in a more dangerous world. The one thing that's gone better than we expected over the last 30 years is less proliferation than some of us thought back then. But on the other hand, we do have to worry about the fact that if there is going to be a conflict, it will not just, well, let's hope it won't involve a nuclear exchange, but even if it doesn't, it's going to involve massive cyber attacks and disruptions, etc., which are going to be unfamiliar and are probably going to be far more dangerous to the civilian population than a straight invasion would be. So we're going to have to deal with the misuse of modern technologies, bio, cyber, and AI, 21st century technologies, and they may be more of a concern than nuclear, although of course a nuclear war will still be the biggest catastrophe.
That's probably a great segue to our the first question. Marty Hellman, you get the honor of the first question. So glad to see you. Good to see you with us today. And let me turn the Zoom mic over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, first of all, for your book, which I read when it came out and found very interesting. And for this seminar today, you're talking about trust and the creation of villains, I think is very appropriate. One thing I'll just mention before I ask my question, I've estimated that the risk of a nuclear war, a major nuclear war, is on the order of 1% per year, which is horrendous. And Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, who has a PhD in mathematics, has told me he not only agrees with that, but I can quote him on it. So we have a really major problem here.
Yes.
Turning to a question, you've talked about the pandemic. Is this, in your opinion, and I should say it is in mine, one more nail in the coffin of national security being bought at the expense of other nations? Is national security becoming an obsolete concept unless it's seen as an integral part of the global security of all nations, including our perceived adversaries?
I think it is, because we know that the virus respects no national boundaries. And also, we all depend on the internet and Facebook and things like that, which are run by companies which don't really respect national boundaries. So it is fairly clear that these risks can't be reduced without international action. So I fully agree with that. And also, I would accept the 1% per year probability of a nuclear war as being something which seems scary, but not at all implausible. And it could grow, because one other thing which at our center we've been discussing is the threats caused by cyber attacks to command and control systems of nuclear weapons. So the risk of an accidental nuclear war is perhaps going up rather than down as well.
I'm watching Bob Brosner and Don Lamb shake their hand vigorously in support of that last comment. Let me turn the floor over to Bob Ladiff now.
Thank you, and thank you, sir, for a very illuminating conversation. My question is, if you can say something about your opinions of the responsibility of scientists and whether it differs now substantially because of the the rapidity with which things move and how tightly people are connected. And it's an ancillary question, the responsibility of funding agencies.
Right, yes. Well, of course, speaking under the auspices of the Bulletin, one knows that the atomic scientists who worked at Los Alamos, and I knew the great John Simpson, who was one of the founders of the Bulletin in Chicago. People like that were people who returned, in a sense, with relief to academia, but they didn't regard it as a sanctuary. They felt they had an obligation to minimize the downsides of the demons they had helped to unleash. And of course, they set a good example. And I got to know in his later years Joe Rotblat, the founder of Pugwash, who of course lived in Britain. And so I think in that case, clearly the atomic scientists set a fine example, and they did have some effect, particularly in the Cold War, of being able to link East and West and be a back channel, because of course science itself is a global activity which can straddle all boundaries of faith and of nationality more easily than other kinds of activity. So that's true. But I think to answer your question, I quote something which was a metaphor given by Michael Atiyah, who was a great mathematician, who was president of Pugwash for a few years. He said that if you've got teenage kids, you can't control what they do, but you're a poor parent if you don't care about them and hope they turn out well. So in the same way, if you're a scientist and you've invented something, it's your creation, and you ought to care about whether it's applied well and try and avoid applications of it which are dangerous. And of course, that therefore means that scientists should encourage the development of benign applications of their work, commercialization. They may not do it themselves, but they should encourage startups to do that. But on the same time, they should warn the political leaders or others of possible downsides. And in the case of gain of function experiments and things like that, this did happen. And I think for a few years, gain of function experiments on vaccines were banned from getting federal support in the US. So that was an example. So that's a long answer in saying that scientists should feel obligated to care about the use of anything they discover. And how can they have an influence? Well, obviously, if they can talk to scientists, so talk to politicians, but of course, most of them aren't really public figures. And that's why I think we really need to encourage scientists to talk to the wide public, or at least talk to charismatic figures who can then amplify their voice with the wide public, because politicians will then listen. And if you take the climate debate, I'd like to mention 4 very disparate people who've had a huge effect: Pope Francis, David Attenborough, Bill Gates, and Greta Thunberg. Those 4 people, all different from each other, they've listened to scientists and they have amplified their voice. And it's that amplification which has made the public care enough that politicians feel they won't lose votes by taking notice of this. And so that's a long answer to the question that the public needs to be influenced by scientists. It needs to understand science. And if the public cares about something, then the public has an impact on politicians, even if the scientists directly don't. So that was a rather long answer, I'm afraid.
It's motivating for the Bulletin. I'm looking at Governor Brown to see if he agrees that the public has an important role in what politicians do. And I know, Governor Brown, I might just cold call you for 2 reasons. One is I know in the nuclear space, you feel often that citizens don't have as much of a role in this kind of high politics around nuclear issues. But I also remember many years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, you were on our podium saying that even that you care about these issues, but unless the public cares along with you, it's really hard to stay focused on it. How do you think about that issue, about the role of the public on these big issues, and the need to kind of continue to beat the drum, to pay attention and get engaged and provide opportunities for them to get engaged? And then Daniel, I'm coming to you next. So after the governor.
Well, I agree with Martin Rees that public figures have to be influenced. The scientists have to influence these public figures, the Pope, even Greta. We don't know who the public figure is ahead of time, but charismatic people who care deeply and are articulate can wake people up. But in terms of the public, because I spent a fair amount of time in recent years talking about these big issues, whether it be 100 seconds to midnight, whether it be existential threats, whether it's 1% a year or 1 in 6 chances in a century of a horrible outcome. People don't want to hear that. It's a rare person that wants to grapple with something so large and so catastrophic. So the key, politics, even now with all the sanctions on Russia, I was just thinking as I was listening, what's the outcome? When do you pull them off, or does it just escalate? So I don't think deep thinking about big consequences is the norm. I would say it is highly deviant to the political process, to ordinary thinking. So that is the challenge of the Bulletin. It's the challenge of people on this program. How do we contribute to an awakening to the danger, and what the prudent steps back from the brink might be?
No, I agree.
Daniel, over to you.
Okay, kind of related. So first, Martin, nice to see you, and thank you for all your efforts. And needless to say, you're kind of the preeminent example of an engaged scientist and doing exactly, what needs to be done. So I just wanted to follow up on this discussion of misinformation and disinformation. This idea that it seems like, it's kind of the end of rational discourse. It seems like a kind of unusual moment. And the connection to facts and, the real world is now up for debate, and people kind of create their own realities, as we've seen, for example, by Trump and now by Putin. So in that context, there's this question of what can be done. And you mentioned security, privacy, and liberty, and we kind of have to choose something to give up. And I just was wondering if you could kind of expand on that a little, and give some hope of where we might, make progress on this.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure I can offer much hope, but and I do think that this issue about polarization of opinion, which happened under Trump, it's not just under Trump. I think it is a consequence of the fact that people get their information via social media rather than by the traditional outlets of the past, because the traditional major newspapers and major radio and TV channels were run by professional journalists who muffled the crazy extremists and presented something which was obviously not always the same, but a sort of balanced view. Whereas what happens now, of course, is that the extreme views get millions of hits on the internet, and if you click on them, you get sent to something still more extreme. And so I think this is it's not just Trump; it's an effect of the social media, and I really again see little chance of easily remedying this. I think we've got to live with it and just hope that the public will eventually become a bit more savvy about how credulous they are of the crazy stuff. I think that we've got to hope that happens, but I'm afraid I don't have any easy answer to that. And I think it does in a sense, coarsen the public debate, doesn't it? If one has to contend with all this sort of thing.
Don Lamb, you have the next question.
Sorry, no answer.
Well, I actually was going to ask basically the exact question that Daniel has just asked. But you addressed a part of this question, so I feel able to also ask. It was very surprising to me and interesting to me when you were discussing in your book about this tension between security, privacy, and liberty, and you know, as history shows, you know, those three things have been in tension, you know, for a long time. But as you've been talking about, it's a very, very different world now. And so how would you have us approach, you know, the problems and how these interact and what to do?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, just to reiterate, the reason that this is a more severe tension now than it was is that we can't tolerate even one person who, for instance, thinks there are too many humans in the world and releases some pathogen to kill off as many of them as possible. That's not a crazy and absurd scenario. And because technology gives people that power, we've got to do all we can to minimize the chance of even one person doing that, because one is too many. And that's why this is a tension. So I don't have any answer, but I suppose there is one answer, which is simply to have a society, a global society, where there are as few maximally embittered people as possible. And of course, if we think of people in the developing world, they are getting scientific knowledge. They know what they're missing because they may not have toilets, but they have the internet. And I think they are going to be aggrieved and embittered. And the same is true of people who are unfairly disadvantaged in the more prosperous countries of the north. So I think this does at least provide a stronger incentive for minimizing inequalities and the causes for disaffection. Because if we could minimize the number of people motivated to do this and the number of extremists, then of course we feel safer. So it's an extra motivation for doing those things which one would like to see done anyway.
Governor, did you just have your hand up? Wait, you're on mute though.
Liberty, privacy, security. Just betting from my experience, people are going to pick security. Therefore, privacy will have to be limited
Yes.
as well as liberty. And if we're going to find that one person, that's a lot of surveillance. So I would say that the West, with its vaunted liberty, which certainly I like, I tend toward anarchism myself as a psychological disposition, that the authoritarian approach is going to look more and more attractive and maybe essential. I hesitate to even verbalize that because it sounds so heretical in the West. But I just have to say, from the way Lord Rees has formulated it, security is going to, people get scared for their skin, for their life. And so they're going to give up privacy and liberty to save themselves from a plague, a nuclear, or whatever the threat may be. So preparing that gives a rather dystopian future as a prospect. And I would have to say, as a politician, I hope I'm wrong, and
Yes.
please don't carry this too far, but don't think it isn't possible. What about that, Martin?
Yes, well, I agree with that. But of course, as I think you'd agree, it's fairly clear what will happen in China. That they will give up privacy because already they are able to monitor almost every financial transaction and people's movement, etc. So that they have, in fact, such intensive monitoring that people don't have privacy. And that will give them greater security than we will ever have in the West if we don't go that route. Incidentally, AI is going to have huge changes on what the Chinese can do. And one thing I mentioned in my book is that the Chinese could have a planned economy of a kind that Marx and Stalin could only dream of, because they have registers of every transaction, the stock in every shop, etc. And so all the things which couldn't be done by Stalin because of lack of information could be done. So the Chinese would be able to use AI for that purpose, and also, of course, use it to monitor everyone, and of course, in rather scary ways to use face recognition and all the rest of it. So I think the advance in AI, which we haven't mentioned yet, is going to be important for that purpose, and could be misused.
In your book, you talk about using the iris of the eye in India to be able to distribute health benefits, and just picking on what you said, the enormous benefits that actually brings, but also the risks. You want to talk about that a little bit more? You want to talk about that a little bit more? Do we have you? Oh, yeah.
Me, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. When I mentioned in my book, it was one of my colleagues in Cambridge actually who invented the iris recognition technique that's used in more than 1 billion Indian identity cards. And so that's a benign use of it, and it's more reliable than fingerprints. But of course, there are dangers in the use of AI to replace humans. I mean, we talked about not trusting other people because we don't deal with them. Not trusting AI is something we need to be more concerned about. We shouldn't trust it, and we all know it's being used in a good way to perhaps improve diagnostics by radiographers and things like that. But it can be used in bad ways. I mean, for instance, something which is happening in big companies in the UK, and I'm sure in the US as well, is using AI to sift applicants for jobs. Not only sort of going through the CVs, and of course, including all the biases that the individuals had who used to make those decisions in the past, but also certainly one British company, they were using facial techniques to try and analyze the emotions of people during a video interview, using a machine which can see how stable you are, how disturbed you are, and all that. And if that starts being done in a big way and believed, then that I think is going to be very dangerous. And so the takeover of these jobs by AI is clearly very dangerous. Although if AI can take over mind-numbing jobs like working in Amazon warehouses and in telephone call centers, that would be good, provided that the companies that run those outfits are heavily taxed and the profits used to set up more better paid and more dignified jobs of a kind where the human element is crucial, such as carers for old and young, teachers' assistants, and etc. If that can be done with the resources raised from these big companies, that would be a win-win situation.
Melissa Harris, you have the next question.
So I caught at the beginning that you described yourself as a techno-optimist. So is there one like positive movement or positive policy evolution happening right now that the Bulletin or perhaps like the world should get behind? Or another way to say it is, what is the most important thing we should be fighting for right now?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think obviously health, especially health in the developing world and dealing with pandemics, is something where science has been our salvation already. And so we need to encourage that. I think two areas. One obvious one is we need more R&D into more efficient and cheaper clean energy if we are to meet our carbon zero targets by 2050. Looking from a British perspective, I feel we should do lots of this because we in Britain emit only 1 or 2% of the world's CO2 emissions, depending on what you count. But we probably have more than 1 or 2% of the world's clever ideas. And so what I think we should do is have a big program, as should all other high-tech countries, the US and the rest of Europe, to develop more efficient, clean energy and all the things that go with it, smart DC grids and storage and all that. And we should do this not only for ourselves, but in order that we can collaborate with the developing world. Because if we think of what may happen by 2050, then there'll be 4 billion people in India and sub-Saharan Africa who now have a very low standard of living and use very little energy. And they are all going to need to have more per capita energy of some kind if they are to develop to a reasonable state and close the gap with Europe. And if they do that, if by 2050 they are at least where China now is, and if they've done this by coal-fired power stations, then those countries will be producing about 40% of the world's present emissions. 40%, as much as that, will come from those countries if they develop using coal-fired power stations. So if we can help them to sort of, as it were, bend over their curve so that they can leapfrog directly to clean energy, as they did to mobile phones without ever having landlines, then that's going to be far more important than just cutting our own CO2 emissions. And an extra motivation, and I think an idealistic goal for all young engineers to try and develop clean energy, not just for the wealthy North, but so that it's affordable by the global South that are going to need more per capita energy. So that's one obvious thing. But another one is food, because we need to feed 9 billion people probably by mid-centuries, and many are undernourished. So probably it requires a doubling of food production in the world. Now that happened between 1970 and now through the Green Revolution, etc., as the population doubled. But it's not so easy to do the new one, especially if you want to avoid encroaching on natural forests and not destroying biodiversity. So I think high-tech food production, so-called sustainably intensive agriculture, artificial meat and things of that kind, that's another high-tech development which is benign. So I think clean energy and intensively produced food are two technologies that are benign and where I think we should encourage idealistic young scientists to work.
I spent the weekend, last weekend or 2 weekends ago, with the president of the Good Food Institute. And when he puts in place, when he shows the data of how destructive current agriculture is and will be to support all the needs moving forward, it just, and the consequences to climate change, it just really pushes you into that direction of the Bulletin needing to focus more on the advancement of food as a response to climate change. He was very compelling anyway. And I saw that in your book. Yeah, it's urgent. We have time for one last question. Daniel, you have your hand up again. Can I give you the last question, and then we'll give Lord Martin the opportunity for a response, and I have some messages at the end to share with the group, and then we'll close out.
Okay, great. I just wanted to follow up. First of all, the notion, there's this vicious cycle. I kind of had this secret hope, and not hope, but as things deteriorate, you have this hope, okay, at some point humanity is going to wake up. Climate change is obviously happening, and we'll start to really make progress. But this idea that there is this cycle where in times of stress, as people realize how bad things really are, they gravitate towards increasing security, which leads to people like Trump and Putin and Xi. I mean, if this is where we're headed, then it makes it less likely that we're going to address these threats. And that's a very scary situation. But my question is, talking about techno-optimism, on the other side, one of the things we often get at the Bulletin is a criticism that we're being alarmist. We've made it through the last 50 years. Scientists are going to figure all this stuff out. We don't need to worry about it. It's all going to be okay. Just trust the scientists to work it out. We've always, solved these problems in the past. Why would that stop? So I wonder how you respond to that.
Yes. Well, I mean, as regards nuclear war, as we heard Mr. Perry's view, 1% per year, and that's not very encouraging if we think a century ahead. So I think that's not been positive. And I think it's true that we need more science as our salvation. There's no doubt about that. But it's not going to be easy because it may not be possible to cope with future pandemics. If we had something with the transmissibility of COVID, but the virulence of Lassa fever or something like that, then of course that might be the end of civilization. So there are those things, and so we've got to do what we can to prevent those and apply biomedicine safely. But I think it's not easy. I think getting to net zero is something which is very, very hard to do. I mean, there are these pledges from China and India even to get to net zero by 2060 and 2070. But it's not easy because we do depend very much on fossil fuels. And in the UK, 22 million people are going to be told to replace their gas boilers by heat pumps, which are more expensive and less efficient. And that's going to be a very hard sell. So I think it's going to be very, very, very hard. So we've got to do the kind of things which are a plus. And of course, cheap, clean energy is a plus. And anything that makes our health better and our food better is a plus. And so we can do those things. But I think we need science. But even with science, I think we're going to face challenges.
So we're coming to the end of our time. Yes. I want to thank everybody.
We haven't mentioned space at all.
Exactly. So this
That's
is
right.
I know. That's my next. I didn't ask one question because I ran out of time. So I'm going to just share with everybody here. Chapter 3 of On the Future focuses on the future of space. And I think quite interestingly, Lord Martin's most recent book coming out is on the future of space. And if you all have just a few more minutes, I want to give them an opportunity to talk about it, but also share that on March 8th, International Women's Day, the Bulletin is hosting an all-women panel on the future of space. And we're going to cover topics of privatization of space and the weaponization of space with 4 fantastic women who are pushing us into new frontiers. But Lord Martin, can I give you the last comment just to give us a preview of your forthcoming book, and then we'll close out with that.
Yes. I should say this book is co-authored with my old friend Don Goldsmith from Berkeley, and it's called The End of Astronauts. It's mainly on the case for human spaceflight, which we think is getting weaker as robots get better and more capable. So our argument is there's no need for humans for anything practical, like assembling large structures or exploring the surface of Mars or anything like that. And I would say myself, as an American taxpayer, I wouldn't want to spend any money on human spaceflight through NASA. On the other hand, I would cheer on Messrs. Musk and Bezos. The reason for that is that first, it's not taxpayers' money, but secondly, they can afford to take higher risks than NASA could afford to take with publicly funded civilians, because we recall that the space shuttle failed twice in 135 launches, but each of those was thought a big national trauma. But a 2% failure rate is acceptable to many crazy adventurers, people who go hang gliding or around the world, ballooning and things of that kind. And so I think we should be glad that there are these private companies, and they will give people a chance, and they will not be tourists. I think they shouldn't use the word space tourism, because that implies it's safe. They use the word space adventure, but there will perhaps be people who will go to Mars, maybe with one-way tickets. And Elon Musk himself has said that he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And that's something which I think he's now 50 years old, so 40 years time, he might be able to go there. That's feasible. And so, although I think it's a dangerous delusion to think, as he and my late colleague Stephen Hawking thought, that we should have mass emigration to Mars, because dealing with climate change on the Earth is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. Living on Mars is worse than living at the South Pole or on the ocean bed. But nonetheless, if there are a few crazy adventurers living on Mars, then we should cheer them on. And that's a possibility. And this is my final remark. If we think very far ahead, they could be those who generate a post-human future. Because by the end of the century, we'll certainly have cyborg and genetic modification techniques to enhance and change human beings. And let's hope they're heavily regulated here on Earth for all kinds of reasons, prudence and ethics. But these guys on Mars, we're away from the regulator, and they're ill-adapted to where they are. So they have every incentive, they have the opportunity to use these techniques. And so within a few centuries, they'll have become a new species. Maybe flesh and blood, maybe electronic. If they're electronic and near immortal, then they can go much further. But for that reason, I think we should cheer on the private venturers, but not spend public money through NASA sending humans into space, because they're not needed for any of the practical things we do with space, nor even for space exploration.
So more of that coming soon in your book. That's
books out in
forthcoming.
April. Yes, coming out in April. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you in this, as I said, one of our first efforts at an Einstein Circle programming. Special thanks to our executive chair, Jerry Brown, for joining us, and particular thanks to our board of sponsors member, Martin Rees, for this, as always, illuminating conversation. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned.